Greetings, my name is Josh Cannon and I am a fan of rock music. Whether it's from the 1970s, 1990s, or 2011, rock music, to me, is the most open-ended form of music out there aside from maybe jazz. As an observer of the listening tastes of the masses, I found it interesting how rock vocalists have evolved their singing styles throughout the decades. Although the term evolved may not be actually correct, because evolution is a term that implies that something becomes greater over time. In this video, I would like to see how rock vocalists have changed their singing styles through the decades. Because as you'll see, change is not always a good thing. This is the Overstimulation Station. Though the first genre I'm going to bring up certainly isn't rock, it is the first time I noticed a bunch of different singers from a bunch of different bands copying one particular vocal sound. Enter the new romantic / new wave genre. This was not only a style of music, but also a style of clothing. 90% of the bands in this genre came from England, hence the phrase "the second British invasion" being used to describe that time period in the early 1980s. It seemed like every singer was required to have a moody, baritone voice with an exaggerated enunciation of every word in the song.
If you leave, don't leave now. Please don't take me. I want a ticket to the world. If I could find my reasoning, sometimes I feel I've got.
It's a singing style that I am not fond of in the least. In fact, it really gets on my nerves, and the fact that so many bands felt the need to copy this style smacks of their desperation to be a part of the status quo rather than make good art. You'll find in this video that this is the case with many other bands as well. Now, I should mention at this point, there were some bands that did this style well, and it did feel more authentic. Duran Duran, for instance, I feel like popularized this style of singing, and then bands like Depeche Mode took it and made it into something unique and cool. But for the most part, most bands were just playing copycat in a vain attempt to gain success more quickly. The first rock vocal trope that I noticed came in the mid to late 1980s in the form of hair metal. This singing style tended to comprise of over-exaggerated cartoony growls with ginormous gang vocal choruses, all drenched in heavy reverb. In fact, everything in the 1980s was bathed in reverb. Everything was bathed in reverb. As comedian Bill Burr once put it, in the 1980s, reverb was like the poor man's auto-tune. A hair metal song usually comprised of a verse that sounded like it was sung by a cartoon rat, then a huge chorus that sounded like a room full of people were chanting along, despite the fact that most of these bands only comprised of 4 dudes. Some of the main offenders of this vocal style were bands like Rat, Warrant, Motley Crue, and Poison. But there were literally hundreds of other bands that sounded just like those bands. This genre of music overstayed its welcome by a long shot and was soon diluted to the point of being a parody of itself. The public wanted a new wave of bands that ripped off each other. Cue the 1990s. In 1991, Nirvana crashed onto the music scene like an Amtrak into a brick wall, and by doing so, killed the careers of hundreds of 80s hair metal bands and single-handedly bankrupted dozens of hairspray companies. What they also did was popularize a new style of singing that many more bands would go on to emulate. As a result, record companies had to come up with a new marketing term to describe this new music style. The term grunge was coined, and the singing style was full of raspiness and aggression. You weren't truly the singer of a grunge band unless you were completely blowing out your vocal cords. But I mean, at least it sounded cool, and it definitely felt more authentic than hair metal. You could even argue that the music from this time period has aged much more gracefully than that of the 1980s. Some of the titans in this genre were bands like Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam. Let's talk about Pearl Jam for a second. Though lead singer Eddie Vedder certainly had the raspiness and the aggression of grunge music, he also had a third aspect to his voice that would set afire the next wave of rock vocalists, and that would be the Yarrow. Yarling is a term that has come to mean an over-exaggerated stiffening of the jaw when one sings, producing a distinctive guttural tone. It's singing like this, yeah, this is a rock and roll, yeah, yeah. Yarling is the vocal style that we would hear in rock music for literally the next 15 years.
Always talking back to me, you won't let it be.
As the mainstream listening audience grew fatigued over the dark and dreary world of grunge, a new musical offshoot was spawning all across America. This new genre was initially referred to as post-grunge, but then morphed into various other titles such as new rock, new metal, radio rock, or my favorite term for it, butt rock. The Yarrow had become the de facto vocal style for male rock singers to express some kind of faux soulfulness in their singing. But when almost every other band on the radio is singing like that, it loses any and all credibility. I could name at least 20 bands that are guilty, to some extent, of yarling. But these are just some of the main offenders.
If a great wave shall fall in your life, you seem to have it all. You seem to have control. Stand here in my heart again.
Now again, not all the bands in these genres were bad. The bands that actually helped evolve the genre and push it forward, instead of just copying what everyone else was doing, are the bands that history tends to smile upon more. Korn is a good example of a band that borrowed greatly from these musical genres, but much like Depeche Mode in the 80s, they took the genre and evolved it and turned it into their own thing. As nu metal dragged into the new millennium, people once again began to clamor for a rock style that was all their own. And what they got was a bunch of sassy, skinny jean wearing sad boys. Wow, rock music sure did change from the late 90s to the early 2000s. The singing style of this weird little era, often referred to as emo or post-hardcore, tended to consist of overly dramatic yell singing with some screaming thrown in for good measure because, you know, they were really fucking sad. There was such an air of immaturity with the lyrics and vocal style of this genre. It was as if the singer was perpetually stuck in some kind of pubescent crisis and things were never going to get better. The music videos from this era weren't much better either. Check out this hilariously cringeworthy scene from the Hawthorne Heights video for Nicky FM. I lose my shit every time I see that. As mainstream music genres such as hair metal, grunge, nu metal, and emo were making their mark in the world of rock, there was a subgenre that had existed the entire time that was becoming more attractive to all the young adults who were transitioning out of the mosh pits and into the dance clubs. Indie rock began breaking into the mainstream with bands like Franz Ferdinand, the Black Keys, Foster the People, and MGMT. The new singing style of indie rock seemed to recycle elements of many previous decades, such as disco and new wave, but left out the more aggressive bits found in the 1990s and 2000s. There weren't many rules for vocalists during that time that indie rock was at its peak, and as a result of that, many bands that thought outside of the box were able to flourish. Also as a result, we saw many bands that comprised of singers that weren't white guys. I don't normally care about this thing one way or the other. I like rock music and I don't really care who is singing it, but I do find it fascinating how this particular time period seemed to include singers of all various backgrounds and ethnicities more so than any other previous rock genre. Nowadays, the prevailing vocal style that I'm noticing in whatever shred is left of rock music is this weird, nasally, reggae-sounding tone. It's almost as if the record companies are trying to compete with the popularity of rap music by having everybody sing with a more urban inflection in their voice than what they would normally have. Take a listen to some of these bands and see if you don't hear what I'm talking about.
She may contain the urge to run away, but hold her down with soggy clothes and breeze blocks. Oh, 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 I'm falling slow, taking my time on my ride. You could be another face that I forget as soon as I move along.
We ain't got the class, we ain't got the tunes that's gonna put us on the map, and I'm a phony in disguise.
It's almost as if everybody is trying to either sound like a blues singer at the turn of the century, or they're trying to sound like the lead singer of some shitty gentrified reggae band. I feel like the success of 21 Pilots and the Black Keys are part of the reason why this vocal style is prevailing nowadays. And it's a style that I cannot wait to die. I have not heard a more inauthentic, fake way of singing than the Yarling of the late 90s. And I guess when I say rock music, I should specify this is more of an indie rock / alternative or new alternative rock way of singing. If you're talking just straight up rock, I don't really know what rock bands are even out now besides Imagine Dragons, but who really likes them nowadays? So those are all the vocal trends that I have personally noticed through the decades. Some of them were not so good, and others were completely terrible, and then others were tolerable. But the main thing I want you to take away from this video is copying or mimicking something else just because it's the status quo sucks, and you shouldn't do it. And you really shouldn't support it, because all that's going to do is continue the status quo, and the status quo is shit. What we want is to foster experimentation and innovation in music and not just keep the same crap rolling out year after year. Remember, history always acknowledges the innovators, not the imitators. All the great bands that come to your mind right now are great because they brought something completely fresh and new to the table and were not afraid to take a risk. The bands that simply just recycled something and tried to repackage it as their own thing with their own band name, those bands have been forgotten already. And the bands that are out now and the rap groups that are out now and everything that's out now that is just copying off of other things, you're not going to hear about them in 10 years. But at the end of it all, these are just my opinions. And if you disagree with them, I would love to hear from you in the comments. If you agree with them, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I would like to start a dialogue with you in the comments one way or the other. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. My name's Josh Cannon. Enjoy the rest of your night.